They did not wait for her to leave the room before they began celebrating. That was the thing Nora Calloway would carry longest. Not the words themselves, though those were sharp enough to draw blood, but the sound of her father's laughter spilling warm and easy through the parlor door while she stood just on the other side of it, one hand pressed flat against the wall, the other clutching a letter she had been sent to fetch. The fire crackled. Someone poured whiskey. Her younger sister said finally, and no one corrected her. She was 24 years old, the second daughter of a Tucson merchant who had built a small empire from dried goods and land speculation and the particular talent of making himself agreeable to men with money. Nora had never possessed that talent. She had her mother's red hair and her grandfather's temper and an absolute inability to stay quiet when something wrong was being done in front of her. These qualities, her father had explained to her at various intervals throughout her life, made her difficult. The word difficult had followed her like a shadow since she was 9 years old, when she had upended a schoolmaster's inkwell onto his desk after he struck a smaller boy for no reason she could see. She had been difficult ever since, reliably and without apology, and the Calloway household had long regarded her the way one regards a storm window, necessary to have, perhaps, but not pleasant to look at. The man her father had arranged for her to marry was named Eli Voss. She had heard the name before. Most people in that part of the territory had. He ran cattle on a high ranch in the Dragoon Mountains, 40 miles from the nearest town, a spread of land so vast and so remote that it had its own weather patterns and its own unwritten laws. People called him reclusive. They called him hard. They said he had come from somewhere back east, that he had built the ranch himself with 2 hired men and nothing but stubbornness, and that he rarely came down to town, and that when he did, men who had thought to test him generally found the experience instructive. He was 36. He had never married. No one had thought to wonder why, because no one particularly wanted to get close enough to ask. Nora's father presented the arrangement to her at breakfast one Thursday, as though he were describing the terms of a land sale. There would be a bride price. Voss had agreed to it. She would travel to the ranch by the end of the month. Her father did not ask her what she thought. He had stopped doing that years ago, after the last time she had told him. She stood in the hallway and listened to her family celebrate her departure, and she felt the particular loneliness of a person who has always been too much for the people nearest to her. Then she folded the letter, put it in her pocket, and went upstairs to pack. The road to the Voss ranch climbed through scrub and red rock, through stands of oak and juniper that grew denser as the elevation rose, until the sky opened up wide and blue and indifferent above a valley that seemed to belong to a different world than the one she had left. Nora rode in a hired wagon with her 2 trunks, and the particular composure of a woman who had decided, somewhere on the long, rattling miles of that journey, that she would not let herself be afraid. She had been given to a stranger in exchange for money and the relief of a household that had never known what to do with her. She would not add shame to that list of things she carried. She would look at whatever came, and she would deal with it plainly, as she had always dealt with things. And if the man was brutal, she would find a way through it. And if he was indifferent, she would build a life from the margins, and either way, she would not cry in front of anyone who had not earned the right to see it. The wagon crested a rise, and the ranch came into view below. A main house of squared timber with a long covered porch, a barn painted the dark red of dried clay, corrals where horses moved in slow, easy patterns, and beyond it all the mountains rising enormous and old, and utterly without concern for the smallness of the human arrangements at their feet. It was, she admitted to herself, beautiful in a way that made something in her chest go quiet and still. Eli Voss was standing at the corral fence when the wagon pulled in. He was taller than she had expected, lean in the way that comes from real labor rather than intention, with dark hair touched at the temples by something just beginning to go gray. He wore no hat, which struck her as unusual. He watched the wagon come to a stop with an expression she could not immediately read, not the cold assessment she had braced for, not the proprietary satisfaction she had feared, but something more carefully contained than either of those things. He helped her down from the wagon without speaking, which she appreciated. He carried one of her trunks himself and directed a young hand named Cass to take the other, and he showed her through the main house, a kitchen, a parlor, 2 rooms. And when he had set her trunk down in the larger of the 2 bedrooms, he turned and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and said, "I imagine you have questions." "Several," she said. "I'll answer them honestly. But there's one thing I want to say first, and I'd ask you to let me finish before you respond." He waited, and she nodded. "Your father told you there was a bride price." I want you to know I refused it. I will not pay for a person. Whatever he told you about the arrangement, that part is not true. He paused. I also want you to know that you're not a prisoner here. I'll give you 1 month. At the end of it, if you want to leave, I'll give you a horse and enough money to go wherever you choose. If you stay, it'll be because you chose to, not because you had no other option. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She had prepared herself for many things on the road up the mountain. She had not prepared herself for that. Why would you do that? He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense of a man choosing his words the way a person chooses footing on uncertain ground. Carefully, without rushing. Because I've waited 3 years to meet you properly, he said. And I'd rather have you here of your own accord than any other way. She did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. He left her to settle in, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet of a room that smelled of cedar and clean air, and she looked at the window and the mountains beyond it, and she thought that she had no idea what was happening, but that for the first time in a long time, she was curious rather than afraid. She had expected to be put somewhere decorative and useless, as she had always been in her father's house, tolerated but unneeded, present but peripheral. She found instead that the ranch simply had too much work for anyone to stand still in it, and that her own nature, the restless, forward-moving quality that had made her difficult in a parlor, made her remarkably useful in a place that ran on the same. Within 3 days, she had taken over the kitchen garden, which had been managed with minimal enthusiasm by a hand named Dory, who vastly preferred horses. Within a week, she had reorganized the supply ledger, which had been kept in a system that could charitably be described as creative. Eli said nothing about either of these things, but she noticed that he looked at the ledger one evening with an expression that might, on a less restrained face, have been relief. She worked alongside the hands, Cass, young and agreeable, Dory, weathered and direct, an older man named Hector who had been with Eli from the beginning and who watched Nora with the careful attention of someone deciding whether to trust a new animal. She did not try to win them over. She simply did what needed doing and did it without complaint. And after a while they stopped watching her quite so carefully and started talking to her instead, which she understood was its own kind of acceptance. Eli rose before light every morning, and she learned to do the same, not because anyone asked it of her, but because the ranch in the hour before sunrise had a quality she found she could not stay away from. The particular hush of a living place still gathering itself, the horses blowing softly in the barn, the mountains going from black to violet to rose as the sky changed. She would be in the kitchen when he came in from his first round of the property, and she would have coffee ready because she had coffee ready anyway, and he would pour a cup, and sometimes they would talk and sometimes they would not, and either way the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which was new to her. She had spent so much of her life filling silences out of anxiety, rushing words into the space before someone could fill it with a verdict about her. With Eli, the silence had no verdict in it. It was simply two people in the same place, which was a thing she had not known could be enough. He was not easy to know. That was not a criticism. She was not easy to know either, and she recognized the kinship of it. He was precise in his speech and economical in his expressions, but she began to notice the ways he communicated that did not require words, the way he positioned himself near whichever hand was struggling with a task, close enough to help without making it obvious. The way he checked the animals each evening with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with care. The way he repaired things that were broken before anyone thought to mention them. She had grown up in a house where men expressed authority through words, loud and particular. This man expressed it through action, through presence, through the slow accumulation of kept promises. She found it bewildering. She found it also increasingly difficult to look away from. 3 weeks in, she was mending a fence line on the east pasture when he came to help. Not because she had asked, not because she was doing it wrong, but simply because it was a two-person job and she was one person. They worked in the afternoon heat without talking much, and at one point their hands reached for the same length of wire and touched, and neither of them moved immediately away, and something shifted in the air between them, like a held breath finally released. He looked at her then in a way he had not allowed himself to look before, and she looked back, and both of them understood something had been acknowledged that could not be unacknowledged, and then they went back to the fence because the fence still needed mending, which was either very practical or very romantic and possibly both. That night she asked him about the 3 years. They were on the porch in the last of the light, and she asked him straight out, the way she asked everything because she had never found a use for indirection. He was quiet for a long time, looking out at the horses in the far pasture. Then he told her. He had been in Tucson on a supply run. He did not go often. He had been passing the mercantile on a Thursday afternoon when he heard a commotion. A crowd gathered, mostly looking away or finding reasons to study the ground, and in the middle of it, a young woman with red hair standing between an old Mexican laborer and a merchant twice her size who was trying to take back wages he had already paid on a pretextual claim. He had stopped walking. He had watched her face the merchant without flinching, watched her point out in a voice that carried across the street exactly what the merchant was doing and exactly what kind of man that made him, watched the merchant's bluster collapse under the plain, specific accuracy of her account. The old man got to keep his wages. The crowd dispersed. She dusted off her skirts and walked away like it was nothing, like she had simply done what anyone would have done, except that everyone else had done nothing. "I didn't know your name," Eli said. "I found it out later. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not about you, particularly, not at first. Just about what it meant to do that. To stand in the way of something wrong when it would have cost you nothing to keep walking." He paused. "It costs something. People don't understand that. To be the person who doesn't keep walking. It costs you something every time." Nora looked at him. She remembered that day, though she had not thought of it in some time. She had not told anyone about it because there had seemed nothing to tell. It was simply what had needed doing. She had not known anyone was watching. She had not known anyone had remembered. "You waited 3 years," she said. "I wasn't certain you'd come. I wasn't certain I had the right to ask. I didn't want to court you through your father. That seemed like starting wrong." The corner of his mouth moved, barely. "And then your father approached me and I thought, well." "Well," she agreed. The stars were coming out above the mountains, enormous and unhurried. She thought about being seen. Really seen, not the seeing that notices and decides you're inconvenient, but the kind that watches a person in an unguarded moment and understands something about who they actually are. She was 30 days into a month she had been given as a choice, and she already knew, with the same clarity she brought to everything, what she was going to choose. But she didn't say so yet. Some things deserve their own time. Her father arrived on the 31st day. She saw the dust of his buggy from the eastern pasture and felt her stomach tighten the way it always had in his presence, the old, involuntary bracing. She walked down to meet him before he reached the house, which was a choice she made deliberately, because she did not want this conversation happening in rooms she had begun to think of as hers. James Calloway had the red-faced look of a man who had worked himself into a grievance on the long road up. He had not received his bride price. She knew this was what the visit was about before he opened his mouth, because her father had never in her lifetime made a journey that was not ultimately about money or the appearance of it. He climbed down from his buggy and looked at her like she was an account that had come up short. "You've cost me," he said by way of greeting. "Good afternoon, Father." Voss refused the payment. That was not the arrangement. "The arrangement," she said, "was made without my knowledge or my consent, and the man you made it with decided he would not purchase a person. I think that reflects well on him." "You think?" He said this as though the activity were faintly absurd. "You're still doing that." "I haven't changed, no. Though I've heard that said about me often enough that I've come to believe it's a compliment." His expression shifted into the harder thing underneath, the thing she had spent her life trying to deflect into something negotiable. "You'll come home. We'll make a proper arrangement, one that benefits the family. You're still of use if I can manage the situation correctly." "I'm not going home," she said. The words came out level and certain, and she felt them as she said them, the weight and the release of them. "I have a life here. I chose it. You don't have a claim on that choice." He told her she was difficult. She agreed with him warmly and said she had come to see it as a defining characteristic and asked if he would like water for the horses before he made the long trip back down. He was still sputtering when Eli came out of the barn, unhurried, wiping his hands on a cloth, and stood a few yards off. Not intervening, not posturing, simply present, which was a thing Nora had come to understand about him. He did not crowd into a situation unless he was needed, and he made sure that anyone who needed to know he was there knew it. Her father looked at Eli and made the miscalculation that men of his particular type always made, which was to assume that restraint was weakness. He made threats. He invoked lawyers and land records and old grievances he had manufactured into legal-sounding shapes over many years of practice. Eli listened without expression. Nora watched her father's voice get louder as Eli's silence became impossible to intimidate, and she thought, not for the first time, about what it meant to be genuinely unafraid. Not the performed courage of someone pushing through fear, but the actual settled absence of it in a person who has decided what they value and what they won't be moved from. Her father left before dark. She stood on the porch and watched his buggy shrink into the distance, and she waited to feel something complicated. But mostly what she felt was a long exhaustion dissolving, like a muscle finally unclenching after years of holding tension it had never been asked to hold. 4 days later, a sheriff's deputy rode up the mountain with a warrant. The charge was fraud, a claim so particular in its constructed detail that she recognized immediately the shape of her father's hand in it. Some matter of a land deed, allegedly forged, with witnesses whose names she did not know but whose reliability she could guess at. Eli stood in the yard while the warrant was read to him, and he looked at Nora once with an expression that was not afraid, but was very tired, and she looked back at him with an expression she hoped communicated clearly that this was not over, and then they took him down the mountain. She saddled the best horse on the ranch before the deputy's dust had settled. Cass tried to come with her. She told him no, she needed him to run the place, and besides, this was hers to do. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a young man revising an opinion he had held for a while, and then he stepped back and let her go. She rode 40 miles alone through the high desert in the last light of the afternoon and the dark of the first hours of night, the mountains at her back and the sky immense above her, and she thought about what she knew and what could be proven and who in Tucson she had any standing with. She was not a woman who had grown up with connections or social capital. She was, by her family's own accounting, the difficult one, the one who had not cultivated the useful relationships, who had made enemies of people who might otherwise have been allies. What she had instead was memory, precision, and the particular ruthlessness of a person who has spent a lifetime learning to make a case with nothing but the truth of it. She arrived in Tucson before the courthouse opened and was waiting on the steps when the clerk arrived. She knew the clerk. A thin man named Aldous, who had worked the county recorder's office for 20 years and who had been present, she happened to know, when her father's dealings with land records had occasionally wandered into the creative. She had never used this knowledge for anything because she had never needed to. She needed to now. She did not threaten Aldous. She simply told him what she knew and what she could prove, and what she intended to do with both of those things if the documentation underlying Eli's arrest was not made available for examination this morning. Aldous looked at her with the expression of a man caught in a current he had hoped was slower. Within an hour, the records were on a table. Within 2 hours, the specific nature of their fabrication was visible to anyone willing to look at dates and compare signatures. By noon, she was standing in the sheriff's office explaining what the records showed, and the sheriff, who was a practical man with no particular loyalty to James Calloway, listened with the attention of someone doing arithmetic and finding the answer uncomfortable. Eli was released before dark. He walked out of the jailhouse into the amber evening light and found her sitting on the steps across the street, still in her riding clothes, her hair escaping in every direction from the pins she had put in it before dawn. He stopped. He looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of a man reassessing something he thought he understood and finding it larger than he had believed. "You came down the mountain alone," he said. "Your horse is very good," she said. "Smooth gait." He came across the street and sat down beside her on the steps, close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. The town went about its business around them. The light went gold and then pink and then the color of old embers. "My father will look for another way," she said. "He is persistent in the service of his own interests." "I know," Eli said. "I'm not worried about him." "You should be somewhat. He's cleverer than he looks, maybe, but you're cleverer than either of you look." He said it without inflection, a simple statement of observed fact, and it hit her somewhere behind the sternum, the particular warmth of being accurately seen. "How did you do it?" She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the street. "You didn't have to do that alone," he said. "No," she agreed. "But some things want to be done alone. So you know you did them." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and the space between them had grown very small and very warm, and she was aware of every point of contact between her shoulder and his arm, and she thought that she had ridden 40 miles in the dark and faced her father and dismantled a false arrest, and she was exhausted and relieved and more certain than she had been of anything in years. She thought about the girl who had stepped between a merchant and an old man on a Thursday afternoon without thinking much about it, and about the man who had watched and remembered, and about the 3 years between that moment and this one, and all the roads, literal and otherwise, that had led from there to a set of courthouse steps in the copper evening light of a desert town. "I'd like to go home," she said. He understood which home she meant. She could tell from the way something in his face went quiet and careful the way it did when he was trying not to show how much a thing mattered to him. "The month ended," he said. "You haven't said what you decided." "I'm telling you," she said. "I want to go home." They married 2 weeks later on the ranch, on the porch in the early morning, because neither of them wanted ceremony more than they wanted to simply be done with the distance between what this was and what they could call it. Hector stood witness. Dory put wildflowers in a jar on the railing. Cass wore his good shirt and looked everywhere but at their faces, which Nora understood to mean he was moved and didn't want to show it. The justice of the peace said what was required to be said, and Eli put a plain ring on her finger, and she looked up at him in the mountain light. The mountains extraordinary behind him, the sky that impossible blue. And she thought that home was not a place you were born into. It was something rarer and more particular. It was the place where what you were made of was not too much but exactly enough, where the parts of you that had always been called difficult were the same parts that made everything work, where the truest version of yourself fit the available space as precisely as if it had been built to receive you. She had spent her whole life being given away, subtracted, diminished to a manageable size. She had arrived in these mountains as a woman who had been told she was a problem to be solved. She stood on this porch as a woman who had ridden 40 miles alone through the dark, who had dismantled a lie with evidence and nerve, who had learned to read a ledger and mend a fence and move through silence without filling it with apology. She was still difficult. She suspected she always would be. But she was also home, and the man beside her had waited 3 years for exactly that. For all of it, for the full, unedited version, and had found it not too much but precisely sufficient. And she thought that the best thing a person could be given was not safety or comfort or even love in the soft decorative sense, but the specific grace of being known completely and wanted anyway. After the justice rode away, Eli stood beside her at the porch railing, looking out over the valley where the cattle were moving slowly in the morning cool and the horses were circling the near pasture and the mountains rose into the sky the way they always had, without apology, without diminishment, entirely themselves. "You know," she said, "I reorganized your supply ledger." "I know you did." A pause. "It was a disaster before." "It was creative," she said, and he made a sound low in his chest that was, she had come to learn, how he laughed when something actually struck him, and she tilted her face up toward the mountains and the light and breathed in the cold, clean air of a place that had no patience for smallness and no interest in what you had been told you were, only what you actually did. Day after day, in the difficult and necessary and beautiful work of making something worth keeping. She belonged here. She had known it for weeks. Now she would say so every morning just by rising before the light and putting the coffee on and going out to see what the day required and doing it without asking anyone's permission. And the mountains would be there when she looked up, and he would be there too. And that would be enough. It would be more than enough. It would be everything she had not known she was looking for all those years of being too much for everywhere else.